The grease-stained coveralls hung loose on Marcus Chen's weathered frame as he wiped his hands on the familiar red rag that had been his constant companion for the better part of 2 decades. At 53, he had seen enough breakdowns, both mechanical and human, to last several lifetimes. His garage, nestled between a laundromat and a convenience store on the outskirts of Portland, had become more than just a place of business. It was his sanctuary, his fortress against a world that had repeatedly knocked him down. The late autumn rain drummed against the corrugated metal roof with the persistence of an old friend asking for shelter. Marcus had always found comfort in that sound, a rhythmic reminder that some things in life were predictable, reliable. Unlike people. Unlike promises. Unlike the dreams he'd once harbored of becoming something more than just another grease monkey in a forgotten corner of the city. The call came at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, cutting through the silence like a blade through silk. Marcus had been working late again, not because he had to, but because the alternative, returning to his empty apartment above the garage, held even less appeal than the cold metal of engine blocks and the sharp scent of motor oil. "Chen's Auto Repair," he answered, his voice carrying the weariness of a man who had answered too many late-night calls from desperate strangers. "Sir, this is dispatch. We have a situation on Highway 26, about 15 miles east of the city. Multi-vehicle accident, weather-related. We need a heavy-duty tow, and you're the closest certified operator." Marcus glanced at the clock, then at the rain-slicked windows of his garage. In the reflection, he saw the ghost of who he used to be, a man with broader shoulders, brighter eyes, and a belief that tomorrow might be different from today. That man had died somewhere between his wife's funeral and his son's last visit, 3 years and counting. "Weather's pretty bad out there," Marcus said, though he was already reaching for his keys. "Might take me a while to get there." "Roger that. Be advised, sir, this one's different. Multiple casualties already transported, but there's still one vehicle we can't reach. Driver's trapped, conscious but in shock. Fire department's on scene, but they need your winch to access the vehicle safely." Something in the dispatcher's tone made Marcus pause. He'd been doing rescue work for over 15 years as a side contract with the county, and dispatchers were trained to be clinical, detached. This one sounded almost apologetic. "What kind of vehicle are we talking about?" "Late model sedan, sir. Went off the embankment about 30 feet down. Well, you'll see when you get there." 40 minutes later, Marcus navigated his heavy-duty tow truck through the maze of emergency vehicles that lined Highway 26. The scene was chaos orchestrated by professionals, paramedics checking equipment, firefighters securing the area, and state troopers directing traffic around the accident site. The rain had intensified, turning the asphalt into a mirror that reflected the red and blue emergency lights in nauseating patterns. Fire Chief Rodriguez approached as Marcus climbed down from his truck, his yellow reflective gear making him look like a walking construction cone in the darkness. "Chen. Good to see you. We've got a real situation here." Rodriguez pointed toward the embankment where powerful LED lights cut through the rain. "Sedan went over about 2 hours ago. Driver's alive, conscious, but we can't get down there safely with conventional equipment. The angle's too steep, and, with all this rain, the whole hillside's turning into a mudslide." Marcus followed Rodriguez to the edge of the embankment and looked down. What he saw made him understand the dispatcher's tone. The sedan had somehow threaded itself between 2 massive Douglas firs, suspended at an impossible angle that defied both physics and common sense. It hung there like a metallic fruit, held up by branches that should have snapped under the weight, over a ravine that disappeared into darkness below. "How the hell is that car still in one piece?" Marcus asked, more to himself than to Rodriguez. "That's what we've been wondering. By all rights, it should have rolled another 200 feet down into the creek bed. Driver should be dead 3 times over." Rodriguez shook his head. "But here's the thing, Chen. The driver, well, you'll understand when you see." Marcus had rigged thousands of towing operations, from simple roadside breakdowns to complex multi-vehicle extractions. But, as he studied the precarious position of the sedan, he realized this would require every ounce of skill and experience he'd accumulated over 2 decades. The margin for error was non-existent. One wrong move, one miscalculated angle, and the car would plummet into the ravine, taking its occupant with it.
What's the plan?
Marcus asked, though his mind was already working through the logistics.
We lower you down with the winch cable.
You secure the vehicle, then we pull both of you back up.
Simple in theory. And, in practice?
Rodriguez was quiet for a moment.
In practice, if anything goes wrong, we lose both of you.
Marcus nodded, accepting the weight of that truth. He'd faced dangerous extractions before, but something about this one felt different. Maybe it was the impossible physics of how the car had landed. Maybe it was the way the rain seemed to part around the vehicle like it was protected by some invisible force. Or maybe it was just the accumulated exhaustion of a man who'd been running on empty for too long.
Give me 20 minutes to set up, Marcus said.
The preparation was methodical, almost ritualistic.
Marcus checked every piece of equipment twice, tested the winch tension, verified the anchor points.
His movements were precise, economical, the motions of a craftsman who understood that excellence lived in the details. The firefighters watched with professional appreciation as he transformed chaos into order, random equipment into a carefully orchestrated rescue operation. As he attached the harness around his waist, Marcus caught a glimpse of himself in the side mirror of his truck. For just a moment, he saw not the worn-down mechanic who went through the motions of living, but the man he'd been before life had beaten him down. The man who'd once believed he could fix anything, heal any wound, rescue any situation. You don't have to do this, Rodriguez said quietly. We can wait for the specialized rescue team. They'll be here in 3 hours.
Marcus looked back down at the suspended sedan.
Through the rear window, barely visible in the emergency lighting, he could make out the silhouette of the trap driver. Something about that silhouette, the way it sat so perfectly still, made his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't name.
3 hours in this weather, that whole hillside's going to give way. Car will be gone, and so will whoever's inside it.
Marcus checked his harness one final time.
Besides, this is what I do.
But, even as he said it, Marcus knew this was different. This wasn't just what he did, this was who he was supposed to be. For the first time in years, he felt the stirring of something that might have been purpose.
The descent began at 1:23 a.m.
Marcus rappelled down the muddy embankment with the practiced ease of someone who'd done similar maneuvers hundreds of times, but his heart was pounding with an intensity that surprised him. The rain made everything slippery, treacherous. Each foothold had to be tested, each handhold verified before committing his full weight. As he got closer to the suspended vehicle, Marcus could see the true impossibility of the situation. The sedan was wedged between the two trees at an angle that should have been physically impossible to achieve. It was as if the car had been gently placed there by some giant hand, positioned with surgical precision to avoid the deadly drop below. But it was when he reached the driver's side window that Marcus Chen's world shifted on its axis. The face looking back at him through the rain-streaked glass was his own.
Not similar. Not reminiscent.
His own face, exactly as it had been 23 years ago, staring back at him with eyes that held the same hope, the same determination, the same unshakable belief that tomorrow could be different from today. The face of the man he'd been before life had worn him down to the nub, before disappointment had carved itself into his features like erosion carving canyons. Marcus hung there in the rain, suspended between earth and sky, staring at an impossibility that challenged everything he thought he knew about the world. The young man in the car, because it was definitely a young man, maybe 30 years old, looked back at him with a mixture of fear and recognition that suggested this moment was as impossible for him as it was for Marcus. "Sir?" The voice came through the glass, muffled but clear. "Are you here to help me?" Marcus found his voice, though it came out as barely a whisper.
"Who are you?"
The young man's brow furrowed in confusion.
"I'm Marcus Chen.
I was driving to Portland for a job interview when the weather turned bad. My car skidded off the road, and I've been stuck here for hours."
"Who are you?"
The question hung in the air between them like a challenge to reality itself. Marcus stared at this impossible reflection of his younger self, this version of him that still believed in possibilities, that still carried hope like a torch against the darkness. The young man's eyes held none of the cynicism that had settled into Marcus's soul like silt in a riverbed. This was him, but him before the world had taught him that heroes were fiction and happy endings were for other people. Marcus started, then stopped. What could he say? That he was Marcus Chan too, just 23 years older and infinitely more broken? That he was looking at his own past, somehow made flesh and trapped in an impossible situation that defied every law of physics he'd ever learned? Instead, he said, "I'm here to get you out." Because in that moment, suspended in the rain between past and present, Marcus realized that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't about the impossible physics of how the car had landed. Maybe this was about something far more important. Maybe this was about the chance to save the part of himself that he'd let die. The young Marcus Chan in the car smiled, and it was like looking at the sun after years of winter. I knew someone would come. I never stopped believing. Marcus the mechanic, Marcus the broken-down 53-year-old who'd forgotten how to hope, felt something crack open in his chest. It might have been his heart. It might have been his soul. But, as he began the delicate work of securing the vehicle for extraction, he knew with absolute certainty that this rescue would change everything. The winch cable sang in the wind as Marcus worked, and, for the first time in years, it sounded like music. Part 2, the extraction of hope. The mechanics of the rescue should have been straightforward. Marcus had performed similar extractions countless times: secure the vehicle, establish proper leverage points, coordinate with the team above to ensure a smooth extraction. But, nothing about this situation followed the normal rules. As Marcus worked to position the winch cable around the sedan's frame, he found himself stealing glances at the young man inside the car. The resemblance wasn't just striking, it was perfect, down to the small scar above the left eyebrow that Marcus had gotten at age 8 when he'd fallen from his bicycle while trying to impress Sarah Mitchell from down the street. The same scar was visible on the young man's face, exactly where it should be. "How's it looking out there?" the younger Marcus called through the partially opened window. "Complicated," Marcus replied, which was perhaps the understatement of the century. He was attaching a support cable to the rear axle when something caught his attention. Through the back window, he could see papers scattered across the rear seat, what looked like resumes, job applications, letters of recommendation. The same documents he'd carried to Portland 23 years ago when he'd been looking for work as an apprentice mechanic at Davidson Motors. The impossibility of it all should have paralyzed him with confusion, but, instead, Marcus found himself working with a precision and focus he hadn't felt in years. Every movement was deliberate, every decision crystal clear. It was as if the presence of his younger self had awakened something that had been sleeping in his soul, the part of him that had once believed he could fix anything. "Tell me about the job interview," Marcus said as he worked, more to keep the young man calm than out of genuine curiosity, though he found himself genuinely interested in hearing his own story told from this impossible perspective. "It's for an apprentice position at Davidson Motors," the younger Marcus replied, and there was such hope in his voice that it made the older Marcus's chest ache. "I've been studying automotive repair for 3 years now. This is my chance to work under a real master mechanic, learn from someone who really knows the trade." Marcus remembered that interview, remembered the confidence he'd felt walking into Jim Davidson's office with his freshly pressed clothes and carefully rehearsed answers. He'd gotten the job, worked there for 7 years, learned everything Davidson could teach him about engines and transmissions and the 1,000 tiny mysteries that lived under the hood of every vehicle. But he also remembered what came after: the layoffs when the economy turned sour, the struggle to find steady work, the gradual erosion of that bright confidence as the world taught him that sometimes, no matter how skilled you were, no matter how hard you worked, circumstances beyond your control could grind you down to nothing. "That's a good shop," Marcus said, testing the cable tension. "Davidson's one of the best in the city. Treat him right, and he'll teach you things you can't learn anywhere else." "You know him?" Marcus paused, considering how to answer. "I've heard good things." It wasn't technically a lie, though it left out the rather important detail that he'd heard those good things while working directly under Davidson's tutelage for the better part of a decade. As he continued the delicate work of securing the vehicle, Marcus found himself thinking about the philosophy that had guided his younger self's approach to life. The belief that hard work and dedication were enough, that if you did your job well and treated people fairly, success would follow naturally. The conviction that every problem had a solution, every broken thing could be fixed, every situation could be improved with enough effort and ingenuity. It was a philosophy that life had systematically dismantled. When Davidson had been forced to close the shop during the recession, Marcus had learned that being the best mechanic in the city meant nothing if there were no jobs for mechanics. When his wife Sarah had been diagnosed with cancer, he'd learned that some things couldn't be fixed, no matter how desperately you wanted to fix them. When his son David had stopped visiting after Sarah's funeral, Marcus had learned that relationships could break in ways that no amount of mechanical skill could repair. "You ever feel like you're meant for something more?" the younger Marcus asked suddenly. "Like you're supposed to do something important with your life?" The question hit Marcus like a physical blow. He'd felt exactly that way at 30, the certainty that he was destined for something greater than just fixing cars for a living. He'd imagined opening his own shop someday, maybe becoming known as the mechanic who could solve the impossible problems that stumped everyone else. He'd dreamed of teaching apprentices, passing on his knowledge, building something lasting. "What kind of important thing?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. "I don't know exactly. But I feel like I'm supposed to help people somehow. Fix things that are broken. Make things better than they were before." The young man's voice carried such earnest conviction that it made Marcus want to weep. "Maybe that sounds naive." "No," Marcus said quietly, adjusting the main winch cable with trembling hands. "It doesn't sound naive at all." But it did sound naive, because Marcus knew exactly where that idealism would lead. He knew about the customers who would cheat you, the suppliers who would take advantage, the economic downturns that would crush small businesses without regard for how much heart and soul had been poured into them. He knew about the sleepless nights when the bills piled up faster than the income, the bitter taste of watching younger, hungrier competitors undercut your prices, the gradual realization that good intentions and skilled hands weren't always enough to survive in an indifferent world. Above them, Fire Chief Rodriguez's voice crackled through the radio. "Chen, how's it looking down there?" "Weather's getting worse up here." Marcus keyed his radio. "Almost ready for extraction. Give me 5 more minutes." But, as he spoke, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The tree branch that was supporting the front end of the car was starting to bend. The constant rain had saturated the wood, and the weight of the vehicle was slowly winning the battle against the branch's structural integrity. Small pieces of bark were falling like snow, and Marcus could actually see the branch sagging in real time. "We need to move now," Marcus said, though he was trying to keep the urgency out of his voice. "Is everything okay?" the younger Marcus asked, and there was something in his tone that suggested he already knew the answer. Marcus looked up at the failing branch, then down at the ravine that disappeared into darkness below. By his calculations, they had maybe 5 minutes before the branch gave way completely. The extraction process, done properly, would take at least 10. For the first time in the operation, Marcus felt the cold touch of real fear. Not fear for his own safety, he'd made peace with his own mortality years ago when he'd lost everything that mattered to him. But the thought of watching his younger self plummet into the abyss, of failing to save the part of him that still believed in hope and possibility and the fundamental goodness of the world, filled him with a terror that was almost paralyzing. "Listen to me carefully," Marcus said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he'd once used when training apprentices. "The situation has changed. We need to get you out of there right now, and it's going to be dangerous." "How dangerous?" Marcus looked at his younger self through the rain-streaked window and saw his own eyes staring back at him, not just the physical similarity, but the same mixture of fear and determination that he'd carried through every crisis of his life. The same refusal to give up, even when the odds were impossibly stacked against him. The kind of dangerous where if we make one mistake, we both die. The younger Marcus was quiet for a moment, and then he smiled, that same smile that Marcus remembered wearing when he'd accepted every impossible challenge that life had thrown at him. "Then, we'd better not make any mistakes." Marcus felt something shift inside him, something that had been locked away for so long he'd forgotten it existed. It was the feeling he'd once had when faced with an engine that everyone else had declared unfixable, the certainty that there was always a solution if you were smart enough and persistent enough to find it. The belief that surrender was never an option as long as there was still something left to try. Here's what's going to happen, Marcus said, his mind racing through possibilities. I'm going to open your door and help you into a safety harness. Then, we're going to climb out together, and I'm going to get you to the top of this embankment. The car we'll have to leave behind. But, your equipment can be replaced. Marcus was already moving, testing handholds on the tree trunk, calculating angles and weight distributions. You can't be. As he worked to open the sedan's door against the impossible angle of its suspension, Marcus realized something profound was happening. For the first time in years, he wasn't just going through the motions of a rescue. He was fighting for something that mattered more than his own life. He was fighting to save the part of himself that he thought was lost forever. The door opened with a groan of protesting metal, and Marcus found himself face to face with the impossible reality of his own past. The younger Marcus was injured, a cut on his forehead, probably from the impact, but his eyes were alert and determined. Are you really here to save me? The young man asked, and there was something in the question that went beyond the immediate physical situation. Marcus Chen, 53-year-old mechanic, worn down by life and disappointment, looked at Marcus Chen, 30-year-old dreamer, still full of hope and possibility, and understood that this moment was about more than a simple rescue. Yes, he said. I'm here to save us both. Above them, the tree branch gave another ominous crack, and Marcus knew their window was closing fast. But, for the first time in decades, he felt truly alive, truly purposeful. This was his chance to prove that the man he'd once been wasn't dead, just buried under years of cynicism and defeat. As he helped his younger self into the safety harness, Marcus realized that maybe the impossible physics of this situation weren't the real miracle. Maybe the real miracle was the chance to discover that the person he'd thought he'd lost, the man who believed in hope and possibility and the power to make things better, had been inside him all along, just waiting for the right moment to emerge. The extraction was about to begin, and Marcus had never felt more ready for anything in his life. Part 3, The Man Who Destroys His Weak Self. The ascent from the ravine began at 2:17 a.m., with the rain intensifying to the point where visibility was measured in inches rather than feet. Marcus had rigged a complex system of ropes and pulleys that would allow them to climb together, sharing the load between his experience and his younger self's physical strength. But, as they began the treacherous journey up the muddy embankment, the philosophical weight of their conversation began to overshadow even the physical danger of their situation. You seem to know a lot about me, the younger Marcus said as they paused at a small outcropping 20 feet up from the abandoned sedan. Below them, the car swayed gently in the wind, held now only by Marcus's winch cable and the grace of God. More than someone should know about a stranger. Marcus tested their next handhold, feeling the rain-soaked earth crumble under his fingers. Sometimes you meet people who remind you of yourself at a certain age. And what age would that be? The age when you still think you can save the world. The younger Marcus pulled himself up to the next secure position, his movements efficient despite his obvious exhaustion. You sound like you've given up on that idea. Marcus paused in his climb, hanging suspended against the hillside, and considered the question that went to the heart of everything he'd become. Not given up. Learned better. There's a difference. Is there? The simple question carried more weight than a philosophy textbook. Marcus looked up through the rain at the emergency lights still flashing at the top of the embankment, then down at his younger self, and realized they were having a conversation that was 23 years overdue. When I was your age, Marcus said, resuming his climb, I thought that if I worked hard enough, if I was honest enough, if I cared enough about doing things right, I could fix anything. Cars, relationships, problems, people. I thought the world was basically fair, and that good people who did good work would be rewarded for it. And now you know better? Marcus reached a stable platform formed by exposed tree roots and helped pull his younger self up beside him. They were now about halfway to the top, and both men were breathing hard from the exertion and adrenaline. Now I know that the world doesn't care how hard you work or how much you care. Sometimes good people lose everything through no fault of their own. Sometimes the most skilled and dedicated person in the room gets laid off because of budget cuts decided by people who've never held a wrench. Sometimes the people you love the most get sick and die, and there's nothing you can do about it except watch them slip away. The younger Marcus was quiet for a moment, processing this information. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of defiance that Marcus remembered feeling himself.
So what's the alternative? Give up? Stop trying? Accept that nothing matters?
The alternative, Marcus said, is to understand that the world is what it is, not what you want it to be. You adjust your expectations accordingly. You protect yourself. You don't invest so much of yourself in things you can't control that their failure destroys you.
That sounds like giving up with extra steps. Marcus felt a flare of irritation that was immediately followed by recognition.
He'd said almost those exact words to his father when the old man had tried to give him similar advice at the age of 25. The conversation had ended in an argument that lasted for months, with Marcus accusing his father of being a bitter old man who'd let life beat him down. It's called learning from experience, Marcus said, though the words tasted like ashes in his mouth.
Whose experience? Yours, or someone else's?
They resumed climbing, each lost in thought. The rain was beginning to ease slightly, and Marcus could hear the voices of the rescue team above them, coordinating their efforts. But the conversation below continued to evolve, taking on the weight of a philosophical debate that would determine not just how they would interpret this impossible night, but how they would choose to live their lives going forward. "Tell me something," the younger Marcus said as they navigated around a large boulder.
"This careful, protected approach to life that you're recommending, has it made you happy?" The question hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. He thought about his empty apartment, his solitary meals, the way he'd begun measuring days not by what he accomplished but by what he'd managed to avoid losing. He thought about the 3 years since his son David's last visit, the way he'd chosen isolation over the risk of further disappointment.
"Happiness is overrated," Marcus said. "Contentment is more realistic."
"Are you content?"
Marcus stopped climbing. 30 feet below them, the sedan groaned and shifted slightly as the wind picked up. Above them, the rescue lights painted the night sky in shades of red and blue. Between those 2 points, suspended in the rain and darkness, Marcus faced the most honest question he'd been asked in years.
"No," he admitted. "I'm not content. But I'm not devastated anymore either. And sometimes that's enough." "Is it, though?"
The younger Marcus had pulled himself up to Marcus's level, and they were now face to face again, separated by less than 3 feet and more than 2 decades of accumulated disappointment. In the emergency lighting filtering down from above, Marcus could see his own features reflected in his younger self's face, but what struck him most was the difference in their eyes. Where his own gaze had been tempered by years of compromise and defeat, the younger man's eyes still held that dangerous spark of possibility.
"You know what I think," the younger Marcus said. "I think you're afraid." "Afraid of what?"
"Afraid that if you let yourself hope again, if you let yourself care about something or someone the way you used to, you'll get hurt again. So you've convinced yourself that the problem was the hoping, not the hurting." Marcus felt something crack inside his chest.
"The hoping is what makes the hurting possible. The hoping is what makes everything possible."
The younger Marcus wiped rain from his face with the back of his hand.
"Without hope, what's the point of any of it?
You fix cars for people you don't care about, collect money that doesn't matter, go home to an empty apartment and convince yourself you're protecting yourself from disappointment.
But what are you actually protecting? What's left to protect if you've already killed everything inside yourself that made life worth living?" "I haven't killed anything. I've just learned to be realistic."
"You've learned to be dead while still breathing." The words hung between them like an accusation, and Marcus felt the truth of them settle into his bones like winter cold. This impossible young man, this reflection of who he used to be, was holding up a mirror that showed not just his face, but his soul.
"So what's your solution?"
Marcus asked, and he was surprised by the anger in his own voice.
"Pretend the world is fair? Act like good intentions are enough? Set yourself up for disappointment over and over again until you're too broken to function? My solution is to understand that being broken doesn't mean being destroyed."
The younger Marcus adjusted his grip on the rope and looked directly into his older self's eyes.
"The strongest steel is forged in the hottest fire.
The deepest wisdom comes from the worst pain. The most beautiful flowers grow in the worst soil."
Those are just pretty words.
No, those are truths you've forgotten because remembering them hurts too much. They resumed climbing, but the conversation continued to evolve, taking on the intensity of a debate between two different philosophies of survival. With each upward step, Marcus found himself forced to confront not just the choices he'd made over the past 23 years, but the fundamental assumptions that had guided those choices. "Let me ask you something," Marcus said as they approached the final stretch of the climb. Above them, he could see the silhouettes of the rescue team preparing to help them over the edge. "When you get out of here, when you go to that job interview at Davidson's, what happens when you discover that the world isn't as fair as you think it is? What happens when you realize that sometimes, no matter how hard you try, things fall apart anyway?" The younger Marcus considered this as they climbed. "I guess I'll deal with that when it happens." "But what if dealing with it changes you? What if it hardens you, makes you cynical, teaches you that caring too much is dangerous? Then, I'll have to find a way to stay soft in a hard world." The simple profundity of that statement stopped Marcus in his tracks. He hung there against the muddy hillside, rain streaming down his face, and understood that his younger self had just articulated the choice that would define the next 23 years of his life. Stay soft in a hard world. Marcus had made the opposite choice. When the world had proven itself to be harder than he'd expected, he'd made himself harder in response. When life had shown him that caring deeply led to devastating loss, he'd trained himself to care less deeply. When love had resulted in crushing grief, he decided that love itself was the problem. But what if he'd been wrong? What if the solution to being hurt by life wasn't to make yourself invulnerable to life, but to find ways to remain vulnerable while building the strength to survive the inevitable wounds? "You know what the real tragedy is?" the younger Marcus said as they reached the final 10 feet of their climb. "It's not that bad things happen to good people. It's that good people let bad things turn them into less than they were meant to be." Marcus looked up at the rescue team reaching down to help them, then back at his younger self. "And what if that's just the price of wisdom? What if naivety is the only alternative to cynicism? What if wisdom isn't about becoming hard enough to survive the world, but about becoming strong enough to remain soft despite it?" The hands of the rescue team grabbed Marcus first, pulling him up over the edge of the embankment and onto solid ground. As he was wrapped in emergency blankets and checked for injuries, he watched them pull his younger self to safety, and he realized that the real rescue had been taking place not in the physical ascent, but in the conversation that had accompanied it. Fire Chief Rodriguez approached as the paramedics finished their initial assessment. "Hell of a job down there, Chen. That was some of the most precise rigging work I've ever seen under those conditions." Marcus nodded, but his attention was focused on the young man sitting in the back of an ambulance 20 feet away. The paramedic was cleaning the cut on his forehead while he filled out paperwork, and Marcus could hear him giving his information to the EMT. "Name is Marcus Chen. Age 30. I was driving to Portland for a job interview when I lost control in the rain." The impossibility of it should have driven Marcus to question his own sanity, but instead he found himself walking toward the ambulance with the steady certainty of a man who had finally understood something crucial about the nature of choice and identity. "How are you feeling?" Marcus asked as he approached. The younger Marcus looked up and smiled, that same smile that had carried Marcus through the first 30 years of his life, the smile he'd abandoned when smiling had become too painful to sustain. "Like I've been given a second chance," the young man said. "Like maybe the universe was trying to tell me something." "What kind of something?" "That the person you become isn't determined by what happens to you. It's determined by how you choose to respond to what happens to you." Marcus felt something shift inside him, something that had been frozen for years beginning to thaw. "And what if you've already made your choice? What if you've already become someone you don't like?" The younger Marcus stood up from the back of the ambulance and extended his hand. "Then, you make a different choice. Starting right now." Marcus looked at the offered hand, his own hand, reaching across 2 decades of accumulated disappointment, and understood that this moment was the real rescue. Not the extraction from the ravine, but the opportunity to extract himself from the prison he'd built out of justified cynicism and protective numbness. He took his younger self's hand, and, for just a moment, he could feel the man he'd once been stirring to life inside the shell of who he'd become. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, the younger Marcus said quietly.
That's something my father used to tell me, though I'm not sure I understood what he meant. Marcus understood.
The weak self wasn't the part that hoped, or loved, or cared deeply about the world. The weak self was the part that let fear make its choices, that chose safety over possibility, that prioritized protection over connection. The weak self was the part that decided that being invulnerable was more important than being alive.
Your father was a smart man, Marcus said.
Yeah, the younger Marcus replied. I hope someday I'm half as wise as he was. As the ambulance pulled away, taking his younger self toward a future that Marcus now understood he still had the power to influence, Marcus Chen stood in the rain and felt the first genuine smile he'd worn in years spreading across his weather-beaten face. The rescue was complete. But, more than that, the resurrection had begun. The next morning, Marcus would return to his garage and find a business card tucked under his windshield wiper. Davidson Motors was looking for a master mechanic to help train their apprentices. The pay wasn't great, but the opportunity to pass on his knowledge, to help young people learn not just how to fix engines but how to fix their relationship with the world, felt like the most important work he'd ever been offered. 3 months later, David would call for the first time in 3 years, tentatively asking if maybe he could visit for Christmas. Marcus would say yes, and, for the first time since Sarah's funeral, the word would carry hope instead of obligation. 6 months after that, Marcus would meet Eleanor Santos, a nurse whose car had broken down outside his garage. She was recently widowed, like him, and carrying her own collection of carefully tended wounds. Their first conversation would last 4 hours and encompass everything from carburetor repair to the philosophy of staying soft in a hard world. But all of that was still in the future. For now, Marcus Chen stood in the rain on Highway 26, watching the emergency lights fade into the distance, and understanding that sometimes the most important rescue you can perform is saving yourself from the person you've allowed yourself to become. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, not because he becomes invulnerable, but because he becomes strong enough to remain vulnerable. Strong enough to hope again, to care again, to risk being hurt again in service of the possibility of being fully alive. As Marcus climbed back into his tow truck and headed home through the clearing rain, he carried with him not just the memory of an impossible rescue, but the understanding that transformation wasn't about becoming someone new. It was about remembering who you were before the world taught you to be afraid of your own heart. The mechanic had thought it was just another rescue. Instead, it had become the most important repair job of his life, not fixing a broken vehicle, but fixing a broken spirit that had forgotten its own capacity for hope. And, in the end, that made all the difference.